is Dallas Kane, and I'm the son of a bitch that's the stuff of legend in the Wild West. They say I could shoot a fly at 50 yards, but I don't need no flies when I'm dealing with real assholes. My reputation precedes me. 6 shots, 6 dead bodies, no extra bullets. Smoking a pipe is more of a habit than a necessity, although some ladies think it somehow adds to my charisma. But fuck it, that's not what I'm talking about now. So, after another idiot who had formed a gang and robbed a couple banks, thinking I couldn't wait to put a bounty on him, I finally came back to town. The sheriff in Virginia City personally handed me the money for his head. After that, I headed to the local saloon to relax. I was just getting my feet up on the table when one of what I call white-collar men came up to me. His neatly shaven face and his suit, which cost more than the whole saloon and its cheap booze, made it obvious that he was from another world. He entered the saloon with an important look, accompanied by 2 tall guards with cold stares. He was holding a leather sack, which he tossed onto the table in front of me. This man, judging by his manners and a suit that cost more than the whole damn city, did not belong to our world. He introduced himself as Mr. Henry Wells, a merchant and owner of several railroad companies as well as several banks. When he blurted out that he was offering $8,000 for cargo security, he tried to demonstrate his importance. I looked at him like he was an idiot. Apparently, there was something big in that cargo gold, bonds, and jewelry. I realized at once that a train with such contents would be a tidbit for the local bandits. I only grinned. The cargo was indeed worthwhile, and the risk was high, but $8,000 was money I'd be foolish to turn down. This white-collar guy knew just who to turn to. There was no one better suited for the job than me. "All right," I said, taking a drag from my pipe. "But I warn you, if you have 1 second's doubt about my work, you'd better get your money back right away. When I take a case, I do it my way." His guards seemed to tense up. Their cold stares stabbed at me like knives, but I only grinned. These guys certainly looked imposing, broad-shouldered, with long leather coats and weapons they didn't bother to conceal. One of them looked at me as if he were ready to draw his revolver at my first movement. The other stood quieter, but his gaze was icy certainty. They were not ordinary bodyguards, but fighters who had been through many skirmishes. Convinced, Wells said, trying to maintain his importance. His voice trembled, but he pulled himself together quickly. "That same evening, I went to the station to meet the driver and inspect the load. When I looked at the train, I noticed at once that the work had been well done. The chests of gold were firmly locked with thick locks. The papers were neatly stacked in an iron box, and the jewels shone so brightly that they seemed to dazzle anyone who looked inside. The guards at the station looked at me with obvious suspicion, but no one dared ask what I was doing here. I decided not to take any chances and to sleep in the freight car. As soon as I laid down on the makeshift bed of an old blanket, I felt a familiar sense of unease. Something about this case was too smooth, too quiet. Such thoughts kept me awake. The next morning, the train moved with the first rays of the sun snaking along the winding tracks like a snake through the plains and sparse forests. I stood at the window of the freight car, watching the horizon, the sound of the locomotive filling the air, and for a moment I was even able to relax. Several guys assigned to guard the train were stationed in different parts of the train. Each had a rifle hanging behind his back and a revolver gleaming on his hip. The regular guards looked like sturdy fellows, but too careless for such an assignment. One of them, named Roy, even grinned when I told him to be on guard. "We've been on 100 of these trips, mister. No one's ever risked attacking our train yet," he grunted, leaning back against the wall. But I knew this wasn't just a ride. These bandits weren't the type to back down in front of a couple of armed guards. This was one of the most violent and dangerous gangs known on these routes. They were called the Wolf Pack, not because of a fad, but for their ability to hunt their prey with inhuman cohesiveness. They did not attack without preparation. Each of their robberies was carefully planned and the target chosen with all risks in mind. I've heard of them before. They once slaughtered an entire escort accompanying a shipment of silver from Arizona. More than 20 men were killed then, and none of those protecting the train survived. The bandits left behind only ashes and empty chests. Every time I heard their name, I was sickened. These men didn't just loot, they enjoyed breaking their victims. Their leader, Jesse Steele, was a particularly nasty bastard. It was said of him that he laughed while his men slaughtered those who resisted. I'd seen him once on a wanted card, broad face, rough features, eyes burning with hatred. I knew that if he was involved in this attack, the guys guarding the train would be in trouble. They were good guys, but the Wolf Pack was another level. They knew what they were after, and Roy and his boys, as it turned out later, were totally unprepared to face them. The sun rose higher, and the train continued its leisurely motion. Suddenly, a loud cracking sound pierced the air, causing me to turn around. At the same time, the train began to slow down. I rushed to the car door and looked out. Ahead, on the tracks, were several large logs, obviously left there on purpose. "Damn it, it's starting," I muttered. At the same time, riders emerged from the thickets on either side of the tracks. They moved swiftly, coherently, like a pack of wolves. The rumble of gunshots rang through the air, and bullets began to rain down on the train. One of the guards in the front wagon collapsed before he could fire back. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to assess the situation. The guys assigned to guard were shooting as best they could, but their clumsiness and lack of real experience made them easy targets. One by one, they fell before they realized that the enemy was clearly superior in skill. "Bastards," I hissed, raising my rifle. One of the riders rode a little ahead, apparently the leader. His silhouette stood out against the rising sun, creating an almost demonic impression. Taking aim, I fired. The bullet hit him squarely in the chest, and he fell off his horse like a rag doll. That gave me a few seconds respite to assess who was left. Seeing that their leader had fallen, the other riders slowed down for a moment. It was enough for me to move to the corner of the wagon and start firing at them from another position. A couple more shots, and 2 riders flew out of the saddle, but there were still too many of them. Suddenly I heard a thud behind me. When I turned around, I saw the door of the freight car open with a crash. One of the bandits had already made it inside. His eyes lit up when he saw the chests of gold. But he noticed me too late. In one swift movement, I snatched up my revolver and sent him to his death. The train started moving again, the driver apparently trying to get us out of the attack zone. But the speed was too slow to get away from the riders. They were surrounding the train, trying to find a weak spot. I knew I had to act fast. If they broke through, it would be impossible to hold the cargo. "All right, you bastards," I said to myself. "If you want that gold, you'll have to die for it." Grabbing my rifle, I began to aim even more precisely. Every shot I fired was fatal. One by one, the bandits fell, their screams echoing across the plain. But I knew this was only the beginning. There were too many of them, and they weren't going to retreat. This was going to be a long day. When the train slowed down, it was clear that this was no accidental interference, but part of a well-planned ambush. The logs, carefully placed on the tracks, made a perfect barrier. The surrounding area was deserted, but the shelter of bushes and rocks was perfect for an attack. The wolf pack showed again how carefully they prepare their strikes. It was their M. The driver must have hoped that he would be able to get around the logs. But just then, 2 horsemen appeared from somewhere over the ridge. They did not fire at once, just watched, like predators looking for a weakness. The delay cost us dearly. Another 5 came up behind them. I noticed that they had split up. 3 went to the head of the train, 2 to the rear cars. It was their style to disperse their forces to create chaos and deprive the defenders of coordination. I looked around the carriage. Roy, who had been grinning smugly, was now clutching his rifle so tightly that his knuckles were white. His breathing had become shallow and frequent, and his eyes darted from window to door. The other guards, 2 young men, looked no better. One of them was even praying in a low voice, clutching a silver cross in his hand. When the first shots rang out from outside, the wagon was filled with noise and screams. The bullets pierced the thin walls, leaving torn holes in the wood. One of the guards, standing closer to the door, collapsed to the floor. A bullet found his neck, and he choked on his own blood. The others, as if waking from shock, began firing indiscriminately through the windows. I realized it was useless. The wolf pack knew how to make their prey waste ammunition. They moved fast, using the terrain and the speed of their horses to remain almost invisible. Every shot the guards fired went into the void. I took responsibility for protecting the cargo. Quickly moving to a corner of the wagon, I took up a position from which I could observe what was happening. My rifle was already loaded. The first rider who jumped out from behind the rock was shot in the neck. He didn't even have time to scream, just collapsed to the ground, and his horse sped away. Meanwhile, 3 of the bandits began to approach the front wagons. One of them threw a burning torch into the roof. The fire flared up quickly, adding to the panic among the guards. I switched to them, trying to get a shot off before they could do more damage. One of them grabbed his shoulder and collapsed, but the other 2 continued on with their business. Tongues of fire began licking the roof of one of the wagons. Then I decided to take drastic action. I made my way to the door and jumped out. The moment my foot touched the ground, the bullet missed my ear. The bandits noticed me immediately, but that was their mistake. The open space gave me more freedom than the cramped carriage. I fired 3 shots in succession. The first rider fell from his horse. The second dodged, but lost his balance and fell, tangled in the stirrups. The third rider tried to pass me from the side, but I had him in my sights, and he was the last victim of my revolver in this round. Meanwhile, one of the guards remaining in the carriage tried to knock down the flames by waving a piece of cloth. It was a pathetic but dignified gesture. The fire, fortunately, had not had time to spread too much, but the carriage was already beginning to fill with smoke. The remaining riders decided to change tactics. Seeing that they were losing men, 2 of them tried to break through to the rear wagons, where the main cargo was. I ran after them, trying to shorten the distance. Cursing my age and fatigue, I still made it to the corner of the car just in time to see one of them climbing onto the platform. My hand instinctively reached for my revolver. I knew there was no time to reload the rifle. A sharp shot rang out, and the bandit recoiled, tumbling backward to the ground. His partner tried to lead his horse to the other side of the train, but stumbled when one of the guard's horses knocked him down. The remaining horsemen began to retreat. Their attack was unsuccessful, but the losses were considerable. By the time things had calmed down, there were at least a dozen bodies lying around the train, including several of our own. The smoke cleared, and the train began to pick up speed again. I stood on the platform, breathing heavily and assessing the damage done. It wasn't over. I knew the wolf pack wasn't going to back down completely, but we'd won this round, and the cargo was still safe, at least for now. The train was picking up speed, but the aftermath of the recent skirmish had left its mark. The freight car was damaged. The bullet-riddled door dangled on one hinge, and inside lay the wreckage of crates and the charred remains of a small fire. Smoke was still rising from the gaps in the roof. I knew it was only the first wave. The wolf pack never gives up that easily. Roy sat in the corner of the wagon, pressing a blood-soaked piece of cloth to the wound on his shoulder. His eyes were glassy, his hands trembling. The guy clearly hadn't expected to face something like this. I gave him a brief glance, but found no words of comfort. Men like him don't live long in the Wild West if they can't control themselves. The remaining guards looked no better. A young guy with a cross around his neck, who had been praying an hour ago, now lay motionless. His body was wedged between two crates of gold. Another guard, clutching a rifle, looked out through the broken window, but his hands were shaking so badly that he was of little use. I stepped outside, surveying the horizon. The terrain had changed. We were approaching a more difficult section of the route. There were rocky gorges ahead, the perfect place for a second ambush. The bandits knew how to use the landscape, and I had no doubt they were already there. The driver, realizing the danger, pressed on steam, trying to increase speed. But the heavy load and the damage was slowing the train down. The wheels were scraping on the rails. The wagon with the cargo was swaying on the bends. It seemed as if the whole train was about to collapse. And then they came again. This time, there were more of them, at least 20 riders, who split into groups and attacked from different directions. They moved coherently, like a single organism. One of them, apparently the new leader, rode in front. His face was hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, but his manner gave him the appearance of an experienced fighter. I picked up the rifle and started aiming. The first shot sent one of them to the ground. The horse, startled by the sound of the shot, bucked and ran away, throwing off its rider. The second shot hit the bandit, who was trying to raise a torch to set the wagons on fire again. But there were too many of them. They surrounded the train, firing and shouting commands. I heard one of them shout, pointing at a freight car. They knew where the target was, and were not going to waste time on the other cars. Roy, despite his wound, got up and tried to cover the door. His face contorted in pain, but he kept firing. One of his bullets hit the nearest rider, who collapsed to the ground. But in the next second, Roy was shot back. He fell backward, hitting his head on the crate. This time, he wouldn't get up again. I pressed myself against the wall of the wagon, trying to focus. At times like this, you can't think about losses. The main thing was to save the cargo and my skin. I pulled out my revolver, quickly reloaded it, and began firing at those who tried to get closer. One by one, they fell, but there were too many of them. The remaining guards were doing their best. One of them, The guy with the trembling hands suddenly found the strength to fire a few accurate shots. This slowed the bandits down, but not for long. Their numerical advantage was overwhelming. And then what I had feared happened. One of the bandits managed to leap onto the platform of the car and grab the door. I pointed my revolver at him, but did not have time to fire. Suddenly, there was a loud crack from behind. The roof of the carriage fell in, and 2 more men collapsed inside. They had evidently used the upper route to get around the defenders. I grabbed my knife, realizing that I had a better chance in close combat. The first of them lunged at me, but I managed to get out of the way and stab him in the side. He cried out and fell, clutching at his wound. The second pulled out a pistol, but I knocked it out of his hands with the butt of my gun. The fight was fast, brutal, and uncompromising. At such moments, thoughts of morality disappear. There is only you and the enemy. Meanwhile, there was an explosion outside. One of the bandits had obviously put dynamite under the rear wagon, trying to distract us. It worked. Some of the guards rushed back to put out the fire, leaving the cargo almost unprotected. I realized that the situation was becoming critical. Gritting my teeth, I grabbed the rest of my rifle and made my way outside. The open platform gave me more shooting opportunities, but it also made me an easy target. I began firing, aiming at those who tried to enter the rail car. Each shot was accurate, but that didn't stop the bandits. They kept moving forward, despite their losses. By the time I'd killed the last of those on the platform, I was barely on my feet. My whole body ached. My arms shook with fatigue. But the train kept moving. Smoke and blood mingled in the air, creating a hellish scene. When the remaining bandits finally began to retreat, I realized this was not a victory. It was just another survivable fight. The cargo was intact, but at what cost? All around me lay the bodies of guards and bandits, while the train, like a wounded animal, continued on its way through the merciless lands of the Wild West. When the train finally broke out of the narrow gorges, I thought the worst was over. But this Wild West does not forgive weakness. Another group of riders appeared on the horizon, and in the center of it, like a king on his throne, rode Jesse Steele. His wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face, but I knew that his eyes, glittering with a cold gleam, missed no detail of what was happening. He was here to finish what he had started. The train rumbled, struggling to pick up speed. The remnants of the guards who could still hold their weapons clustered around the freight car. Their faces reflected a mixture of fear and determination. I had to take the lead, though I'd never wanted to. "Hold your positions," I shouted, heading for the platform. The riders, obeying Jesse's signal, began to encircle the train. Their movement was so coordinated that it seemed as if they were one. I quickly assessed the situation. A fight was inevitable. But I wasn't going to fucking retreat until the bastard was down. Jesse seemed to sense my determination. He stopped his horse a few yards from the train and shouted, his voice loud and confident. "Dallas Kane, you're a good shot, but you lost. Give me the load, and maybe I'll let you live." I answered, not with words, but with a bullet. My shot hit the rider closest to him, who collapsed from his horse. Jesse didn't flinch. He just smiled and made a sign to his men. They rushed to the attack. The first wave of bandits hit us like a tsunami. Bullets whistled, and screams came from every direction. I fired as fast as I could, aiming at those who tried to break through to the cargo. The guards beside me fell one by one, but their sacrifice gave me time. I was surviving on the limit of my strength. Jesse, meanwhile, kept to the side, watching the chaos. He took his time, knowing his men would weaken me, but he had underestimated one thing: I had no intention of losing. I reloaded my revolver and leapt to the platform in front of the freight car, taking the lever. Nothing stood between Jesse and me now. His gaze met mine. There were more words in that silent moment than in any dialogue. He dropped the reins of his horse and started toward me. His revolver gleamed in the sun like a cursed relic. I knew this fight would be the last either for him or for me. We both fired almost simultaneously. My bullet grazed his hand, ripping the revolver from his fingers. His shot missed, but I felt the hot air from the bullet burn my cheek. Jesse lunged at me and we clashed like wild animals. His fist hit me in the jaw and I nearly fell over, but I knew I couldn't let him get the upper hand. With the last of my strength, I struck him with the butt of my rifle, forcing him to retreat. He stumbled and fell to his knees. I raised my revolver and pointed it at Jesse. "It's over," I wheezed, breathing hard. Jesse looked up at me. His eyes were no longer haughty, just tired. He didn't ask for mercy or try to negotiate. He just smiled, bloody foam on his lips. "Do you think you've won, Kane?" he whispered. "But this West will swallow you the way it swallowed me." I didn't answer. The gunshot shattered his words, leaving only an echo in the desert. His body collapsed to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been cut. It was over. When the train started moving again, I climbed onto the platform. The remnants of the gang scattered, realizing that their leader had fallen. I looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to sink, coloring the sky in shades of purple. The cargo was still safe, and my duty was done. But inside, I knew that this victory came at too high a price. Dallas Kane had survived, but at what price? The final chapter of this journey was just beginning, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what it would bring. When the train finally reached the station in St. Louis, I felt the tension release me. The gunfire, the death, the blood, it was all behind me. But the echoes of that chaos still echoed in my head. I jumped off the platform, treading heavily on the wooden planks, and headed toward the railroad company's office, where my employer was supposed to be waiting for me. Mr. Henry Wells, with his immaculately shaven face and expensive suit, stood at the window watching the approaching train. His expression changed from indifference to marked relief when he saw me. I pushed open the door, and he turned around. I put my hat on the table, interrupting his attempts to speak. The cargo was intact. The men were almost gone, and I was miraculously alive. He opened the massive safe behind his desk, pulled out a thick wad of dollars, and slid it toward me. His look tried to say more than his words, but I didn't care anymore. I took the money and walked out without turning around. I left the office without looking back. I walked a few blocks and found the first saloon I could find. The place was dirty, with a smoldering odor of tobacco and cheap whiskey, but I didn't care. I sat down at a table in the corner, and the bartender brought me a glass and a bottle without waiting for my order. With each sip of whiskey, I felt the tension release. The shadows of the dead still flickered in my mind, but their voices were getting quieter. I lit my pipe, staring at the faded light of the lamp above the bar. It was a victory, but a hollow one. "Dallas Kane, you're still alive," I thought, staring at my reflection in the cloudy glass of the bottle. Alive, but by what miracle? The Wild West it swallowed Jesse Steele and his whole gang, but left me behind as if mocking me. Maybe fate still had plans for me. Maybe she wanted to make sure I'd watch other fools make the same mistakes over and over again. I smiled to myself, taking a drag on my pipe. If the Wild West wanted a joke, I was ready to play my part. But that would be tomorrow. And tonight, I drink to those who didn't make it. To each and every one of them, whether friend or foe. The bartender came over to refill the glass. I picked it up, looking at the murky liquid. Picking up the glass of murky liquid, I silently paid tribute to those who had not survived the journey. And with that, I took a big gulp. The morning was ahead, which would bring a new story. But that's another story. So, it continues, friends.